ask Margaret to come up, who is a professor of epidemiology and children's health at Dartmouth. She will discuss the what, why, and how climate change impacts water and dietary sources of toxic metals. Thank you, Margaret.
Thank you, and I'm really delighted to be here for this momentous event, and very thankful to Kari for the invitation and the organizers. So yes, what I'll be talking about is how we could use epidemiology to understand the impacts of climate on children's health, and talk about some of my work on drinking water and dietary sources of metals. So in epidemiology, our aim is to stop disease even before it starts. We don't want kids to get sick. We don't want kids to get infections and food allergies and asthma and cancer. And we do that by identifying the cause. So we know the story of John Snow, where he discovered that through his meticulous epidemiology, that the Broad Street pump was transmitting cholera and causing cholera deaths. And by stopping that pump and turning it off, he was able to prevent cholera, even before the Vibrio cholera organism was identified. So here we are with cholera as a continued public health issue. And we've also heard about the widespread impact of infections. Well, infections also cause other diseases. So Helicobacter pylori, for example, causes stomach cancer. And then there's a toxicant, aflatoxin, from a fungi that produces liver cancer. And then we know that viruses, like human papillomaviruses, can cause anogenital and other malignancies. So epidemiology has illuminated the many health effects of cigarette smoking, and as we've heard in the session, now we're faced with fires. Epidemiology has found things like asbestos, ionizing radiation, sunlight, and now with rising temperatures and our health impacts there. So I just want to mention that even genetic diseases often have an environmental trigger, and that's true for phenylketonuria, which is an inborn error of metabolism. So it's a genetic disease that we screen our babies for that's triggered by the ingestion of phenylalanine. And this is the case for most genetic diseases. And the ones we don't know, we just may not know the environmental trigger yet. So what may be less obvious are the potential impacts of climate change that are quite pervasive and that potentially impact our exposure to toxic metals. And I want to use an example here in California, where the Salton Sea has been diverted to supply water to the southern part of the state. And so the communities now are left with dust plumes from the diverted water and the dryness in the air, and that dust can contain sulfates, pesticides, and metals. So we've heard about rising temperatures and the potential for increased microbial contamination of waters. And so we may need to turn to other water systems. And those systems that may come from deeper aquifers, they may contain heavy metals, as was in the case of Bangladesh, where we took tube wells to provide the population with clean water, and millions of people were exposed to arsenic and in some cases manganese, to neurotoxins to children, and potentially with other health effects associated with those exposures. So we know power plants emit toxic metals. We're very familiar with many pollutants that come out of power plants, including mercury. And we've seen how mercury has increased since the Industrial Revolution. So these emissions deposit onto the Earth's surface, into our pristine lakes and into our oceans, and then they move up our food chain into foods such as fish. And as well, climate affects mercury cycling and the bioaccumulation and the biomagnification of mercury into the food system. So we've already heard that there's a very beautiful and precise biology that occurs in development, in fetal development and in early childhood, and that these are the delicate tissues that can be impacted by pollutants and toxicants. So one example is that the offspring of women who consumed fish that was highly contaminated with mercury from a chemical effluent from a factory, they developed a very severe neurotoxicity called Minamata disease in Japan. And then here, nearby in Berkeley, there are investigators who have studied a Chilean population in a very arid region. And a new water system was introduced and inadvertently exposed the population to arsenic. And what the investigators found was it was the people who were exposed during the time of peak exposure around the time they were born that had very high mortality from lung disease and other cancers as compared to people when they were exposed later. And in my own studies here in the United States, I've also noticed, like studying tanning lamp use and arsenic in the drinking water and other exposures, that the earlier you're exposed, the greater the cancer risk. And that made me concerned about pregnant women and young children. So in 2009, we started the New Hampshire birth cohort study. And we recruit women who are on private drinking water supplies. So these are private wells that are not regulated. So they're not routinely tested like our public water systems are. And these sources could contain high levels of toxicants. And we've had just wonderful response from the clinical community and from the participants themselves, and we're now nearing about 2,000 maternal infant dyads. So in one of our first papers, we found that the amount of arsenic women consumed from their water was related to the amount of arsenic that was in their urine. But the surprising finding was the amount of rice they consumed was related to the amount of arsenic that was in their urine. And we knew from plant physiologists that the rice grain could take up arsenic. And then in our models based on our cohort, eating a half a cup of rice per day was equal to drinking 1 liter of 10 microgram per liter of arsenic in water, and that's the safe drinking water standard right now. So what's the food most of us fed our babies? Rice cereal. So 80% of our cohort introduced their baby to rice cereal in the first year of life. And at age 1, over half of them were feeding their infant rice or a rice product. And just like pregnant women, the infants who were ingesting rice and rice products had higher urinary arsenic levels than those who hadn't. So what are the health impacts of these very common levels of exposure? Well, in our work, mothers who urinary arsenic was related to the number of infections their infant experienced early in life, with a dose-response relationship and no evidence of a threshold. And we also found an increased risk of wheeze. And then in our collaborative work, including with Corey, her lab found decreased T lymphocytes in the circulating cord blood of infants in relation to their mother's urinary arsenic concentrations. And this could signal potentially decreased vaccine response, as well as increased risk of infection. We've also seen changes in gene expression of the placental tissue on the fetal side, including an inflammatory marker, IL-1 beta, and a developmental gene, GLE3. And we've also seen changes in DNA methylation. We heard the description of epigenetics earlier. And so these represent not changes to the DNA code, but the way genes function. And it also reflects the proportion of immune cells in a baby's circulating blood. Well, we have a whole new body of knowledge now on the importance of the microbiome. This is such an exciting emerging area of science. And we know that our microbiome is important not only for nutrient metabolism, but for priming the immune system and our immune function. And this is especially important for infants. So toxic metals could impact and be impacted by the microbiome. So another interesting tidbit, arsenic was used as an antibiotic. It was kind of used for everything. As a pesticide, it's an antibiotic. So it was used, salvarsan was used to treat syphilis before the introduction of penicillin. So we know it's an antibiotic. And then if we looked at a study that's a gut model, the microbes in the gut metabolize toxic metals. And some of these create more toxic species that are more readily absorbed into the gut. And then we've done a study on 6-week-old infants and looked at their gut microbiome. And we've seen distinct clusters based on the infant's urine arsenic concentrations, and that certain microbes seem to be perturbed. So we have lower levels of certain species that we know are important for immune training and that have been related to reduced risks of asthma and allergies. And that, as we've heard, as infections increase, we can anticipate a greater use of antibiotics. And this could have a huge impact on health, because we know antibiotics perturb the microbiome and the development and the healthy development of a microbiome in an infant. And this is going to be important because in our study, almost all infants have some kind of infection in their first year of life. If you had an infant, what's the most common thing you go to the doctor for? What's interesting in the US population and in our cohort is about half of them take a medicine, and often those are antibiotics. All right, so what are we going to do? Well, again, this is an adaptation of a seminal paradigm described by Ricky. And it shows that exposure leads to an internal dose of the exposure, leading to biologic responses, then ensuing preclinical and clinical outcomes. Well, where does most of our funding go? Well, it goes here to treat disease. So as I told you, as an epidemiologist, we want to intervene early. We want to stop the exposures before the downstream health consequences. And this is called primary prevention. And this is where we can have the greatest impact. So in keeping with this, the US EPA has lowered the drinking water standard for arsenic as our knowledge has increased. And actually, certain states have gone to even lower levels based on the scientific evidence. And as I mentioned, or didn't mention, these standards don't apply to private wells. So for most people and most children who don't have very high arsenic in their drinking water, diet is the primary source of exposure. And in a 2009 European Food Safety Authority panel on which I served, we recommended to reduce arsenic in food, and that we also noted that young children ingest proportionally higher amounts of arsenic for their body weight than do adults. And then in 2014, Codex Alimentarius of the WHO and the UN Food and Agricultural Organization set a recommended guideline of 200 nanogram per gram or parts per billion. And then in 2015, the European Union acknowledged the vulnerability of young children and set even a lower standard of 100 ppb. The FDA followed suit with a proposal in 2016, but it's only for infant rice cereal. And we're thankful to our pediatricians and the Academy of Pediatrics for coming out with a statement after our work and others to say that introduce your baby to a variety of foods and a variety of textures, not just rice. And then Consumer Reports has been really instrumental in testing a variety of metals in rice and reporting on them. Congressman DeLauro introduced a Rice Act requiring the FDA to set a limit, saying the government has an obligation to ensure food is safe. And the Government Accountability Office did an assessment in 2017, and they just came out with their report recently. So I just want to add and a reminder that multiple pollutants are present in our food, and those can depend on climate and the growing conditions. For instance, in flooded paddy fields, you get higher arsenic and sometimes mercury. So as water becomes more scarce, farmers may go to drier conditions and growing rice in dry climates. And this can increase the levels of cadmium in rice, and that's another toxicant and a potential endocrine disruptor. So again, we need to be mindful of the nutrient content, the toxicant content, and what types of toxicants we might be introducing into our food system based on the choices that we're making. So thankfully, our emerging science is allowing us to get a more complete and precise picture of what children are exposed to, the totality of their exposures, and what some of the health consequences of these exposures are. So for example, in our study, we're using monitors that monitor a wide spectrum of contaminants. We have all these sensors and imaging methods and geospatial methods for early childhood and into childhood to look at these downstream and early indicators of health outcomes. And just lastly, I wanted to say that we have a new institute at Dartmouth, the Irving Institute for Energy and Society, that brings diverse teams together, including epidemiologists and healthcare providers. And so to get a health perspective, as we heard earlier, into the conversation. And in terms of thinking about solutions, I did want to say, bring us in early in the conversation about energy solutions, about climate, about policies, about product development, about planning cities. We need to come in early in order to come up with optimal solutions at the get-go. And just to reiterate that I think wanting to create a brighter future for our children is something that we all want. And then just lastly, I want to thank, as we said earlier, it takes a village. I've had wonderful colleagues and collaborators like Kari, hardworking students, and I want to thank our funding agency, and I want to thank you all. Thank you.
We have a few minutes for questions for Dr. Karagas. Yes.
Hello, thank you for your presentation, really eye-opening. My name is Paige Knappenberger. I work for an organization called Climate Nexus. We are currently tracking and monitoring Hurricane Florence's approach to North Carolina and South Carolina. And I know one of the concerns that has been raised is that there are a lot of coal ash pits in the area. What kind of threats does that pose to water, air, children in the near term, but also in the longer term?
Wow, that's such a great point.
Question.
Yeah, that's a complicated one. I mean, I'm not a modeler and I can't predict, but should those contaminants get into the drinking water or food system, or into the air, even what the children are breathing, I mean, those areas are laden with toxic metals. So I think it's a concern, and what I like is that you're bringing up that concern, and that we can think about that concern, and hopefully people will think about that concern as the storms are hitting. Those are not things people normally think about, and I think that's the point of this event, is to raise the awareness of these other effects, and certainly in my presentation, so thank you.
Let me see. Another question. While we're asking for another question, I think that's a great question, and Dr. Maldonado and I were just talking about the increased radiation after the Japan earthquake that we saw in Napa wine here. So there are do you want to say a few seconds about it? Because you probably know more about it than I do.
Also ask her about the animal food, the animal waste pits that are also lying in the pathway of Florence right now.
We were just talking about that because I heard that as well. I was reading the reports, and there are, as Dick Jackson mentioned, and also I heard the reports about there's a lot of pig farms and they have a lot of pig waste. And but nobody said what we were going to do about it. They said, well, it's just a concern. But I think they're trying to evacuate people and animals, and I don't know what they're going to do about those. And I don't know how they're housed, but I can't imagine they're going to. Open pit lagoon. Yeah. Dr. Jackson.
They're so-called lagoons of waste. And the problem is that, and I actually did a lot of work on Hurricane Floyd, the place is loaded with tube wells. and you get this flooding over, and the whole Piedmont was covered with 2 feet of water, mud, and hog waste, and it goes straight down into the wells, and it's very hard to clear a deep well when you've got, they pour Clorox in, but it doesn't work terribly well.
And then we can talk about disinfection byproducts and the effects of those as well.
So, Margaret, I just want to share that we have also a group of researchers at Stanford that have been working in Bangladesh and with rice fields. And as the water levels go higher, it's not pollutants. They're actually seeing a higher saline content.
Right.
And we're seeing hypertension and preeclampsia in our pregnant women. So again, a climate ramification with food and rice in particular. There was another question?
Just a very quick one. Is all rice the same?
Good to have you in
Is
the
all
audience.
rice is all rice the same in terms of arsenic? Is California Yolo County rice better than Bangladesh rice?
That's a terrific question as well. And I think that's been the challenge, is that it varies very widely. U.S. grown rice has some of the highest concentrations. Some people think it's because arsenical pesticides, what I mentioned, had been used prior to the introduction of organic pesticides, were sprayed on cotton fields, for example, and some of those cotton fields are used to grow rice now. But it is, taken up by the rice grain preferentially. There's variability due to like the cultivar, the climate, the growing conditions. There are a lot of factors, including the fact that arsenic was used as a feed for chicken, and that chicken waste is used as fertilizer too. So I mean, there's natural soil, et cetera. But great question. It's very diverse. So the consumer can't decide.
In California, we use chicken waste as hog feed, and I'm not making that up.